Thank you all for joining us. As many of you know, I am Matthew Silverman, the director of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to our lecture with Professor Britt Tevis, who will be discussing anti-Semitism in U.S. history. We're living in a moment when anti-Semitism is on the rise, making it more important than ever to understand and explore the deep historical and political roots of anti-Semitism in the United States. By uncovering overlooked narratives, Professor Tevis will help us see how anti-Semitism has been used to undermine Jewish civil and political rights, and how the ideologies that fueled it continue to shape our world today. We extend our gratitude to Andrew R. Ammerman for sponsoring our summer 2025 lecture series. Andrew dedicates this season's learning in loving memory of Josephine and H. Max Ammerman and Stephen C. Ammerman. Sponsoring lectures is a meaningful way to honor or remember a loved one, or to mark a significant occasion, such as a yard site, a personal or professional achievement, or a milestone celebration. Your sponsorship donations, as well as contributions at all levels, allow us to continue offering most of our lectures free of charge for all participants. For more information on how to get involved, please visit our website. As always, feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. Kindly keep your questions concise and incomplete sentences. We will address them at the end of the lecture, though you can submit them at any point during the presentation. The lecture is being recorded and will be available on our website. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Professor Britt Tevis is the Phyllis Backer Assistant Professor in Jewish Studies in the Department of History at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. Her work focuses on the intersection of Jews and American law. Her forthcoming volume, Sanctioned Bigotry, a documentary history of anti-Semitism in the United States, is scheduled for publication by Yale University Press in 2026. And I just heard that pre-orders are already starting, so you can, we'll send you a link in case you're interested in doing so after the program tonight. And lastly, Professor Tevis earned her PhD and JD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So with that, I now welcome Professor Tevis to join us. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Matt, for that lovely introduction. And thank you also to Becky Levy and for having me and for hosting me. I feel particularly honored in this moment to be here because I know that anti-Semitism is something of the kind of topic du jour in this moment. And so I think for many of us, we probably are hearing a lot about anti-Semitism in the spaces that we occupy. And so I hope that this evening I can offer a fresh perspective on that subject, and that you'll leave hopefully having something new and useful to think about. So tonight, I want to make two big claims. The first claim is methodological. And what I mean by that is the first big claim is about the practice and study of history, and the idea that we need to think about history and American history specifically in order to understand anti-Semitism in the United States today. That may seem perhaps to some of you like something of a banal claim. Oh, history, of course, history is an important discipline. Of course, we're going to think historically about this topic. However, traditionally, particularly in academic spaces, which has had an effect beyond the academy, anti-Semitism has been a topic that has been largely ignored in the United States. It has not been a topic that has been explored by scholars for the most part, for really the entirety of the discipline of American Jewish history. In fact, it is so prominently absent, the study of anti-Semitism, that there's a name given to this phenomenon called American Jewish exceptionalism. And American Jewish exceptionalism is the idea that the United States is distinct. It is different. Most importantly, is different from Europe, which in this paradigm is treated as a monolithic entity. as opposed to a collection of nation states. It's different than Europe. It's better in so far as how it has treated its Jewish population. The Holocaust happened there, and America is special. And therefore, anti-Semitism, while it may have, occurred here, there, everyone has a few examples, perhaps most famously, the lynching of Leo Frank in 1915 in Atlanta, Georgia. Those are the exceptions that prove the rule. This thinking, this American Jewish exceptionalist outlook, really has been quite pervasive in academic spaces, which has resulted in really scholars ignoring the subject of anti-Semitism as a scholarly topic for historians to pursue. As a result, historians have really ceded ground to other people to explore this topic. And as a result, today, when we hear about anti-Semitism, so often we hear about anti-Semitism and learn about anti-Semitism from either advocacy organizations or public intellectuals, and I use that phrase kind of loosely in this moment, who have no other necessary background. Perhaps they're often themselves Jewish, but offer their opinions about anti-Semitism without any further or in-depth study. And as a result, the definitions of anti-Semitism that we see deployed today in policy spaces and just everyday conversations about anti-Semitism tend to either be quite redundant, really deploying understandings of anti-Jewish bigotry and discrimination that have been kind of floating around in scholarly spaces and intellectual spaces for the last 150 years, or they're often far too broad to be useful and applied, or on the other hand, very narrow and hyperfixated on very particular dimensions of anti-Semitism instead of thinking about anti-Semitism holistically. And I think that our conversations are the worse for that. So today, again, my first claim is that we should take the history of anti-Semitism in the United States seriously, which is hopefully something that you will come to conclude that I have done. And the second claim that I want to offer tonight concerns our substantive understanding of what precisely anti-Semitism is. And so to discuss that, I'm going to now share my screen. This is the most stressful part of my presentation every time, making sure this part works. Okay. Hopefully this is on our screen. Excellent. Okay. So what can we learn about anti-Semitism in the United States by examining archival materials, which is how historians, that's oh, thanks for the confirmation, whoever sent that. It's the data that historians use in order to craft narratives about what happened in the past. And so tonight, I want to offer a probably somewhat different understanding of what anti-Semitism is. So often we hear that anti-Semitism, when we read in the newspapers and in The Atlantic, we read that anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory. I imagine that many of you have read somewhere at some point in your life, or said at some point in your life, or thought anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory. It's about Jewish control of the world, and everything falls under that category. But conspiratorial thinking and conspiracy theory is certainly important to understanding anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism in and of itself, when we look at its occurrence and manifestations in American history, is actually a political program. It is a political program that is designed to deny Jews civil and political rights. It is a political program that is meant to deny Jews equality, to deny Jews the rights that are afforded to non-Jews, non-Jewish citizens around them. So this is a manifestation really of inequality. It is a program designed to ensure Jewish inequality. Now, it has been motivated in America by three major lines of thinking. The first is Christian supremacy and white nationalism, and particularly this effort among a certain subset of Protestant Americans to eliminate the separation of church and state. So that is one major through line that we can see in anti-Semitic episodes and individuals and ideas in America. The second major intellectual underpinning of anti-Semitism, of this political program to deny Jewish equality, is in fact conspiratorial thinking and the belief that Jews are secretly controlling the world. And this idea has some particular elements that we can, particular elements, especially in the United States, that we'll go into further this evening. And the final, really central intellectual underpinning of understanding this program for Jewish inequality is racialism or scientific racism. It's the ideology of race, the belief that humans can be categorized into biologically distinct columns and that people's physical attributes define their intellectual capacities and their moral capacities. And I'm going to discuss more about what I mean by that. But these three are the three central intellectual underpinnings that have motivated the political program to deny Jews equality. Now, how has this manifest? In an array of different ways? And often, particularly among academics, there's a lot of debate about whether anti-Semitism is even worthy of scholarly study insofar as it seems like there are so many different things that could potentially fit into this pot, right? We think of anti-Semitism often as including the worst kinds of violence, right? Mass murder in Jewish sacred spaces, but also vandalism and spray painting. And obviously these are, ugly tweets or whatever one calls the things that are posted on X now. So these are obviously on two different ends of the spectrum in severity, right? Murder and the loss of life versus, an insult on what was formerly Twitter. And so it is true. And I think that one useful reason this definition is useful is because it allows us to group together otherwise seemingly disparate acts and manifestations of anti-Jewish bigotry, using understanding that these acts are aimed at a particular end, and that end is Jewish inequality. So again, the reason I think this is a useful definition is it allows for events and these episodes to be categorized into different buckets instead of just listed as a chronological, here's every bad thing that's ever happened to Jews, which is in and of itself not a way of thinking historically. It is also a definition that is narrow enough that allows us to exclude certain things that we could all collectively agree are bad, but not necessarily bad because of people's Jewishness. So it excludes what needs to be excluded from the definition of anti-Semitism. And it's also broad enough that it includes all of these different manifestations. The final pitch that I'll make tonight for what I think is really the most useful understanding of anti-Semitism is that this definition is something that I thought about and concluded not in the present moment and long before October 7th, which is another way of saying that this is these are conclusions that I've drawn not in a state of heightened emotional and intellectual and a state of feeling threatened, but actually prior to this current moment in which anti-Semitism seems to be a topic that many people are interested in. So how did I draw this conclusion? Well, now this is what I call the section of my talk that I call the kind of show your work part, the show your work. And it's the most exciting to me insofar as I'm a historian, so I love documents and I love primary sources and I love having the opportunity to share them. And so I'm going to do that now. Before I do, the documents that I'm sharing with you tonight, I've drawn from a volume titled Sanctioned Bigotry. The book is so new that Yale has not even created a cover for it yet, but it is available for pre-order. My publisher has stressed that, and I quote, "Pre-orders are everything." So if you feel so inclined or are interested in reading more, this is a collection of it may actually be 180 documents spanning from 1654 through 2024. And these documents highlight episodes of anti-Semitism in the United States between those years, and they are divided thematically into categories such as immigration and race, and defamation, and they really illustrate the different manifestations of anti-Semitism in the United States. They're all annotated. And again, that when I first decided to create this volume, I did so because it doesn't exist. This volume doesn't exist, and that is because for so long, many scholars have operated under the belief that anti-Semitism in the United States has just never been a big deal, not worthy of something, never, not totally worthy of study. And that is a contention I wholeheartedly reject, and that's why I spent many years putting together these primary sources so that people have access to reading about the array of anti-Jewish discrimination and bigotry and violence in the United States. Okay, so as I mentioned, the very first major intellectual inspiration for anti-Jewish sentiment in the United States has been Christian supremacy and white nationalism, which I'm lumping together. And this has been, and the efforts to blur church and state. And this has been a means of discriminating against Jews and minimizing Jewish rights and denying Jews equality since day one. Jews in the United States before the American Revolution operated and lived in the United States during the colonial period under a system of toleration, which was the same system that they lived under in Europe, which meant that they were granted rights via charter to live in the colonies according to a certain set of rules which were different according to whoever was in charge of each individual colony. That system of toleration really held over in many respects after the revolution. So what you're looking at here are American foundational documents, the preamble to the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And these documents, famously do not discriminate against Jews. They famously do not include language that require Jews to take oaths to serve in public office. And they, in fact, reject efforts to incorporate religion and into the federal government. But this is only at the federal level. The same cannot be said at the level of the states. And in fact, a majority of state constitutions in the period immediately after the U.S., the American Revolution, in fact, it did incorporate discriminatory clauses into those state constitutions, which in fact resulted in anti-Jewish discrimination. So here what you're looking at is an early constitution, an amendment in an early constitution of North Carolina saying, quote, that no person who shall deny the being of God or the truth of the Protestant religion or the divine authority either of the Old or New Testaments, or who shall hold religious principles incompatible with the freedom and safety of the state, shall be capable of holding any office or place of trust or profit in the civil department within this state. In other words, unless one was willing to take an oath of allegiance to Christ, one was precluded from serving in public office in North Carolina. The requirement that one take an oath was one of the most common form of anti-Jewish discrimination in the revolutionary and immediately post-revolutionary period here in the United States. Now, this is not the only example that we have of this kind of discrimination. Here is another example from Maryland's Constitution. Now, in Maryland, Jews were not permitted to serve in public office. They were not permitted to serve on juries. And in fact, they were not, this is my favorite one because it's ironic, they were not allowed to serve as lawyers. Imagine a Maryland with no Jewish lawyers. It's hard to believe. So here we see no other test or qualification ought to be required on admission to any office of trust or profit, that such oath of support and fidelity to the state, and what else do you need? A declaration of belief in the Christian religion. So unless you were about to declare oneself Christian, you were ineligible. And again, the exact text of that quote appears later, quote, that every person appointed to any office of profit or trust shall, before he enters on the execution thereof, take the following oath. I do swear that I do not hold myself bound in allegiance to the King of Great Britain, and that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to the state of Maryland. So far, so good. And shall also subscribe a declaration of his belief in the Christian religion. Okay, that's the part that if you're Jewish, it might make you stop. Now, these kinds of oath requirements lasted until the late 19th century in certain states. So I don't want you to think that this was only an immediately a revolutionary and post-revolutionary phenomenon. In some states, they persisted until after the Civil War. But this was not the only kind of anti-Jewish discrimination that we can see from the blurring of church and state here in the United States. What you're looking at here is a law from the state of California, which was a Sunday closing law, which required that businesses close for the Christian Sabbath. And these laws were passed in many states in two major rounds, one in the mid 19th century, one in the late 19th century. And in some cases, these laws really reflect a really quite pure intention on the part of their Protestant champions, which is that they wanted the communities that they lived in to collectively honor the Christian Sabbath, and they thought that the best way to do this was to halt commerce. Now, that is not the case. That's not true in the case of the passage of this Sunday closing law. But before I go into the particularities, the specifics of this Sunday closing law, I want to just point something out here, which is to say that sometimes, and this is an argument that students, my students at least often puzzle over, sometimes it is possible that people are acting in good faith and still impose anti-Semitic legislation. Jewish inequality does not require hatred. Right? It does not require for the person imposing that inequality to actually hate Jews. As is in the case of these Sunday closing laws, all it requires is treating Jews differently. And for those, I should explain more clearly why this would be so detrimental, because Jews honor the Sabbath on Saturdays and not on Sundays. Jews, in order to be able to comply with Jewish religious laws, would shut their business on Saturday. In the places where there were Sunday closing laws, they were then also required to have them shut on Sunday. And this was a tremendous financial, this would be a tremendous financial hit for them, because they were having to be closed double the length of the closest competitor. And so this was quite economically advantageous for Protestants, very harmful for the Jewish citizen. And this was well known. The economic harms that were resulted from imposing these laws was well known. And in the case of this law, this particular law, which was passed in 1858, it was ushered through the California state legislature by this man, a man named Congressman William Stowe of Santa Cruz County. He said on the floor of the California State Assembly, and seen through the passage of the Sunday closing laws, that he was passing this law very specifically with the intention of preventing Jews from settling in California. Now, I was born in California, so take that, William Stowe. But he said to the California State Assembly, "I have no sympathy with the Jews, and would, were it in my power, enforce a regulation that would eliminate them not only from our county, but from the entire state. I am for a Jew tax that is so high that Jews would not be able to operate any more shops. The basis of Republican institutions is the Christian Sabbath and the Christian religion. The Jews must join the majority. They are a class of people who come here only to make money and who leave the country as soon as they have money. They do not invest any money," and this is my favorite line coming up, "and they do not erect any of the beautiful houses that decorate our country." I love that he threw in the aesthetic judgment there. It's very petty of him, and anyway, they all hope someday to settle in their Jerusalem. The Bible is the basis of our institutions, and the lawmaking process must support its commandments. So again, here, this is a case in which, on the one hand, he is blurring church and state. He is trying to enforce the recognition of the Christian Sabbath, and ensure that businesses were closed on Sunday, and specifically for the purpose of deterring Jews from moving to the state of California. So again, in this case, the Sunday closing law does actually reflect anti-Jewish animus, but I would argue that anti-Jewish animus is not necessary for the imposition of Jewish inequality, that anywhere that these laws persisted, regardless of the intention of the people passing them, by preventing Jews from being able to earn a living, they were in fact imposing anti-Semitism. Now, these are just a few examples, and I want to move on to others, but I'm just going to kind of gesture towards some others. Here we have two examples, one from 1923 and one from 1960, of the ongoing Remains With Us effort to pass a federal amendment to the Constitution declaring the United States a Christian country. The first major push for this first arose in 1864 in the aftermath of the United States Civil War, but it has been ongoing since then. Again, this effort to obliterate any pretense of church-state separation continues with us, and is, if anything, I think in this particular moment that we're living through, on the rise. Additional examples of Jewish inequality that has resulted from the blurring of church and state include mandatory school prayer and movements to return school prayer to the public schools. Efforts in different states. This is actually an issue that's currently being litigated in several American states, in which states have offered or have permitted private adoption agencies to deny Jewish parents the right to adopt children. And I learned of this only relatively recently. And one thing I was surprised to learn is that this is a particularly acutely harmful and kind of malicious policy, insofar as apparently Jewish parents are disproportionately inclined to adopt, but because of their Jewishness, are determined to not be trustworthy by the state to adopt children, which again, I should say, I find to be just particularly insulting and painful. The idea that the state would tell Jewish parents that they are not trustworthy with children, and do not merit being parents is frankly egregious. Other examples include the denial of Jewish prisoners access to kosher food, or Jewish prayer books in prisons. And finally, party politics and political events that happen on Saturdays, including specifically Saturday caucuses and in primary races, which deny Jews who consecrate the Sabbath on Saturday the chance to participate in those voting and political moments. So this, again, Christian supremacy has been one major motivating factor that has resulted in Jewish inequality, but it's not the only one. Yeah, the second major intellectual driving force behind anti-Jewish inequality has been indeed conspiratorial thinking. Conspiratorial thinking is not the only, and conspiracy theory is not all of what anti-Semitism is, but it has been central. So conspiratorial thinking is the central idea behind this is that Jews supposedly control the world and control events, and people have explained the world around them through this understanding of a degree of unnatural, unmerited Jewish control. The most easily the most famous and most harmful example of anti-Jewish conspiratorial thinking and conspiracy theory is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. You're looking here at the covers of three different versions of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion that I found in Maryland, actually in the National Archives. Every so often, constituents like to mail copies to their congressman, saying, "You're not going to believe what I just found out. Someone in Congress should definitely look into this." And so they'll mail the entire copy of the protocols to their representatives. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion originated in the Russian language in Russia in the first decade of the 20th century, and it made its way to the United States during World War I. It first a military attaché first encountered the document while stationed in Eastern Europe. And it quickly made its way through, the upper ranks of the U.S. military and the U.S. State Department, who for some period of time actually believed that the protocols were genuinely a roadmap explaining the Jewish effort to take over the United States. So these are a document, if I should say, if you've ever tried to read them, I gotta say, they're very repetitive. This is not great writing. This is not great writing. This is not Shakespeare. I thought they'd be a little spicier, to be honest with you. I was disappointed the first time I read them. But in this text, we learn that Jews are attempting to take over the global financial system, and they're attempting to take over the means of cultural production, film, theater, etc. And they're doing this for the purpose of attaining global control of the world. So these make their way to the United States, and they're printed in English and then reprinted. They are disseminated singularly most by the car magnate Henry Ford, who reprints them in the Dearborn Independent, a publication that he then bound into volumes and then also reprinted them as a full book. And these through the Dearborn Independent and through his reprinting. And by the way, he also he intentionally did not copyright these works because he wanted anyone to be able to reprint them and send them to whomever they wanted, which is helpful for me as a scholar in trying to reprint them, but also detrimental for those who are trying to prevent the spread of anti-Semitism. In any case, this is probably the singular most detrimental and problematic and harmful conspiracy theory for Jews, but it's not the only anti-Jewish conspiracy theory that has operated in the United States. Here are examples, just to wind up the protocols, here are examples of military intelligence division telegrams, also from the National Archives in Maryland, in which we can see expressions of these military intelligence officers revealing just how seriously they're taking this document. So on the left, we have a Captain Snow, a military intelligence officer of MI4, saying, "Have you ever read these documents on the Jewish protocols? If not, I strongly urge you to read them. I have read them through very carefully twice and have underlined several sentences, I can't remember, see the last word. In any case, note the list of Jews on pages 7, 8, and 9, including Victor Berger, who was a known socialist. It reads like good dope, which is another word for information. And recent world developments would seem to bear out these protocols. So again, the protocols weren't just understood to be this conspiracy theory or something to laugh at or chuckle at, but actually understood by very high-ranking military officers for a very long time to be a very important document that was revealing of the evil and the intentions of Jews, including Jews in the United States, to try to take over. This resulted in a mass surveillance program of nearly every Jew, and particularly Jews living in in New York City, including Jews such as Felix Walberg and Jews who were assuredly absolutely had nothing to do with communism or socialism or radicalism in any sense. This was just by being Jewish, because of this document, one was rendered suspicious. But these are not the only kind of anti-Jewish conspiracy that operates. One that is actually currently lingering out there, it concerns abortion and the idea that Jews are the major funders and providers of abortion in the United States. I read in one person's scholarship that while a minority of Americans are against abortion, a minority, within that minority, a plurality, in fact, believe that abortion is a Jewish conspiracy aimed at trying to eliminate the white race. So this is a conspiracy that Jews are trying to kill out white Americans through abortion. So here we see an example. This is a postcard that says, "I am Faye Waddleton." She was the leader of the president of Planned Parenthood. "We kill and murder unborn babies for high profits and Black power. Jew doctors are the high priests of blood and slaughter. Freemason Supreme Court justices illegally forced Roe Wade on a gullible public. We lust and murder for greed. Your unborn baby could be next." And this says the Black butches of abortion. Butcher, I think they meant butcher of abortion. So here we see a number of themes that we see commonly in anti-Semitic rhetoric and in the United States, which is first and foremost, this notion that Jews and Black Americans are working collaboratively to hurt white Americans. There's this notion that Jews are the puppet masters and they are controlling Black Americans. Another example of this, in fact, is in the aftermath of the Civil War. There was this notion that Jewish landowners were granting too much freedom to new Black citizens by letting them farm their land without enough oversight. And they were doing this to stick it to the white landowners. So here we see this that Black power and Jew doctors. I will also add a variation I've seen on this idea is that Jewish doctors are working in collaboration with specifically lesbian nurses. So there you see the tying together of homophobia with anti-Semitism. Here, this is anti-Black racism being tied together with anti-Semitism. You also see in this image on this postcard, it's reminiscent of accusations of blood libel, of the notion of Jews, which is the idea that Jews would murder Christian babies for the purpose of using their blood during the Passover Seder. So there's that reference to blood and slaughter, being high priests of blood and slaughter is present in this idea. So that's yet another conspiracy theory that persists and in fact propagated into this at this present moment. That conspiracy theory relates to a larger category of Jews being accused of harming the Americans' national health. And what you're looking at here are two different examples in addition to the accusation that Jews are the primary providers of abortion in the United States. On the left, you see a piece of campaign literature that was disseminated by a congressman named Claire Hoffman, who was from Michigan, vehemently anti-labor, vehemently anti-immigration, vehemently anti-Semitic. And here under the polio theorem on the left-hand side of your screen, you can see, I wrote this text out so that I'd be able to see it. The text says, it is reported, the polio serum. It is reported it has already killed and maimed children. Its future effects on minds and bodies cannot be gauged. This vaccine drive is the entering wedge for a nationwide socialized medicine by the U.S. Public Health Service, heavily infiltrated by Russian-born doctors, according to Congressman Claire Hoffman. And then it says, in enemy hands, it can destroy a whole generation. Just 10 years earlier, he had made a speech, Hoffman had made a speech on the floor of Congress um, to, uh, to defeat the Fair Employment Practices Commission, which was one of the earliest anti-discrimination in employment pieces of anti-employment discrimination legislation in the United States. And when he spoke out against it, he said, he basically denied that discrimination in the United States was really a problem, and then said it's a well-known fact that many of the most powerful financial institutions in this country are controlled by Jews. He then said, quote, he offered figures, quote, showing the proportion of the volume of the business of the country owned and controlled by individuals of the Jewish race, the exact number of Jews outstanding in the professions, science, arts, and the number of high positions in the federal government held by or which are under the control of members of that race. So because Jews in this moment were in fact advocating for the passage of anti-discrimination legislation as it applied to employment spaces, he was claiming, well, Jews have so much power anyway. Why are they complaining? And in this case, this is again, this idea that Jews are, in this case, offering the polio vaccine to harm Americans is closely related to the similar accusation that COVID was the advent of Jews. And this was a flyer on the right-hand side. You're looking at a flyer that a colleague found on the the SEPTA system, which is the public transportation system in Philadelphia. He found it on a seat, and here you see a list of names, and these people are identified as Jewish and connected with the CDC. And the accusation is that Jews are profiting off of COVID, and this is something that they have promoted. And frankly, this is an idea that has found traction with the current Secretary of Health, RFK Jr., who in a speech given in the summer of 2023 claimed that Jews and Asians are less susceptible to COVID, and that this was, in fact, he said he doesn't know who designed it to harm Caucasians and African Americans, but that Jews and Asians are, for some reason, aren't as susceptible to COVID. So again, conspiracy theory and conspiratorial thinking is absolutely central, but does not in and of itself sufficiently explain anti-Semitism. There are others, but I think that the comments offered by RFK Jr. are a perfect segue into understanding the last, and to my mind, least discussed, but most important element of anti-Semitic thinking in the United States as a motivation for imposing this inequality, which is anti-Semitism that has been inspired by racism and racialism and scientific racism. So scientific racism is the idea which was quite prevalent by the mid-19th century in the United States. The idea that people can be categorized into biologically distinct columns, and that what people looked like defined their intellectual capacity and their moral capacity. So people's ability to think well and their ability to make good decisions was defined by what they looked like, and what they looked like was unchangeable and distinct. There were these distinct races, and of course, these races existed on a hierarchy. There is a superior race; those were white people, and an inferior race. Those were Black people, but there were also all sorts of other races, and really the different categories depended on which scientist one subscribed to. And for those of you who are interested in this topic, I strongly recommend taking some classes or going to lectures on the history of race. One of the most fascinating histories and history of science subjects. But suffice it to say, the reason this is relevant in the case of and the discussions of anti-Semitism is because in the United States, Jews, like everyone else, underwent the process of racialization, which is to say that they were identified by others as belonging to a certain race. In the 19th century, in some cases, people defined Jews as white. That was a very tiny minority. Another minority defined Jews as Black. Most people, however, defined Jews as Jews. They saw Jews as existing as their own distinct racial category. And we can see that through in many texts, but we can also see that in this image. What you're looking at here is the front of a postcard from 1879. And this was drawn in the aftermath of an incident called the Manhattan Beach episode, in which Jews were denied the capacity to stay at a hotel, the Manhattan Beach Hotel, by a man named Austin Corbin. This is right on the heels of Joseph Seligman, a pretty famous banker, being denied the capacity to stay at the Grand Union Hotel in Saratoga Springs in 1877. And here, this postcard is meant to convey to the person looking at it, to the recipient, why, like the obvious reasons why one would not want Jews to stay at one's hotel or in the hotel room next to you. And normally, if I'm in a room with a group, I'll ask, what do we see here? What am I looking at? So, but I'm going to have to pretend I'm going to be both sides, both the person asking and answering the questions. What we see here are this Jewish family. And the first thing I would point out is that we can see they all look alike. They are all virtually indistinguishable from one another. Their facial features are incredibly similar. And that is intended to convey that race is immutable. These are members of the Jewish race, and there's nothing they can do about it. They're always going to look the same from the time of the Bible through 100 years from now. You can also see, of course, their oversized noses, their very big lips. Their skin is intentionally dark. Is intentionally supposed to serve as a point of contrast with the sunbathers to the left, who are intentionally conveyed as presented as being fair-skinned. They also have very dark curly hair. Their hair is frequently described as kinky. And they're dressed, they look very ostentatious. They're gaudy, frankly. All of these visual cues are meant to convey to the viewer the racial distinctiveness of the Jewish individual. It goes without saying, of course, that these people are intended to be portrayed as unattractive, but it's not just that they're supposed to be ugly. This ugliness is intended and does, in the late 19th century, convey to the viewer that they are ugly on the outside because they are also ugly on the inside. They are, first of all, greedy. That is what's conveyed with these large noses. They go where they are not wanted, right? They are clearly outliers on this beach, and they're here when they shouldn't be. They also do not conform to normative expectations of sexuality and gender. In another image from the same episode, which we can see here on the left-hand bottom corner, this is, again, meant to memorialize the same event in which Jews are trying to secure access to Manhattan Beach, which is in New York City. You can see on the left that the man and the woman have swapped outfits. And that is intended to convey another Jewish supposedly racial trait, which is that Jews don't conform to normative sexual expectations, that Jewish men are in fact like Jewish women, and Jewish women are in fact like Jewish men. So these are, and in the right above these two on the left-hand side, you can see Corbin's white Jew and whiter Jewess. And by putting the white Jew in quotations, this image, which appeared in a magazine called Puck Magazine, again, was meant to convey they're not white. They are not white. They do not conform. They do not belong in this category, this upper echelon, in this racial hierarchy. Now, the reason this is significant is because in the United States, race has been used as a tool explicitly for the denial of rights, for being able to determine, race has been used to determine who should be eligible to secure what job, who should be eligible to secure which apartment and live in which neighborhood, who should be eligible to attend which school. And who should be eligible to stay in which hotel and eat at which restaurant. So because of the absolute centrality of race for the how America has handed out really access to rights and the operation of rights. Race and racism has been absolutely central for everyone, including for Jews. And here are ways in which Jewish racialization has operated to exclude them from, in this case, public places of public accommodation. And Jews' exclusion until 1964 from hotels was a nationwide phenomenon. And in some states, it was actually really kind of astounding numbers. I can't remember. I think at some point in the post World War II period in Maine, something like 74% of places of public accommodation denied Jews the right to stay there. That's an astoundingly high number, an astoundingly high number. But it wasn't just places of public accommodation. Here is another example of Jewish racialization that's transpired, that was ongoing in the late 19th century. This was a book titled The Original Mr. Jacobs, A Startling Expose. It's an incredibly anti-Semitic text, really peddling anti-Jewish conspiracy theories, that was published in New York City in 1888. And included in this text is the diagram that you see here, which is meant to offer readers the capacity to identify Jews in their immediate vicinity. Another unique element of supposedly members of the Jewish race, was their capacity to blend in very easily, and that made them dangerous. And so this diagram purported to help non-Jews identify Jews so that you could get them away from you. But it wasn't just people running in the hotel business or places of public accommodation. Law enforcement officials also deployed racialized conceptualizations of Jews for the purpose of arresting people, for the purpose of determining and of fighting crime. Here we have a police bulletin from Chicago in 1891, in which the general superintendent of police told the general public to look out for the man who is featured right here. And he's described as having committed the crime of obtaining money by false pretenses. Of course, the association with Jews and money and the idea of Jewish greed is something that really permeates anti-Jewish racialization and anti-Jewish rhetoric generally. And here, this man is described as having a slim build, black hair, sallow complexion. Sallow does not mean white; it means dark. So again, I frequently see that this idea that Jews are white, that Jews have always been perceived of as white, and that is just simply, historically speaking, not been the case. Jews, for many, many years, for many decades, the vast majority of Americans did not perceive Jews as white. They perceived Jews as Jews. Often they would call Jews Israelites. In some cases, they call them Hebrews. Here we see, in fact, that this man is described as having a Hebrew nose. And in fact, beginning in 1899, the federal government also began to deploy the category of Hebrew as a racial category within U.S. immigration services. So when Jews arrived to the United States, to Ellis Island, they'd be categorized as belonging to the Hebrew race. Here again, this had some pretty severe outcomes, particularly for Jews who were subjected to the criminal justice system. Here you have an image from a newspaper in the 1920s in Chicago. These are two young men. This is Leopold and Loeb, the two young Jewish men who were accused, probably correctly, of murdering a third boy who was 14 years old. But regardless of whether or not these young men, in fact, murdered one of their cousins, their trial is just cannot be understood to be legitimate by any means, insofar as the courts deployed and used phrenology and craniology and the reading of their skulls as evidence of their supposed guilt. So here again, this is an image from the Chicago Daily Tribune in 1924, purportedly supposing to offer this is a phrenologist offering an analysis of their skulls. And you can see, for example, that Richard Loeb is said to have, quote, a feminine nature shows in nose. So these two men were supposedly, these two Jewish men during their trial are portrayed as being women. Again, this is supposedly a distinctly a Jewish trait, a racial trait belonging to Jewish men. And his feminine nature, you can see, of course, in the Jewish nose. Again, it should go with that. It goes without saying, but I will say this is a ridiculous. Phrenology is a completely illegitimate science. Racial science is a completely illegitimate science. People are not divisible into biologically distinct categories that are immutable, nor do how people look indicate precisely their moral capacity or intellectual capacity. That belief is toxic and, in fact, was espoused most famously by Nazis. But it also was quite prominent here in the United States, and unfortunately is actually on the rise again. As I mentioned, this idea of racial science and anti-Jewish racial ideology made its way into American federal immigration law by 1924 and by 1921, and then 1924 with the passage of two extremely limiting immigration laws, which can be said to be the reason that America failed and refused to accept refugees during the Holocaust. I think I have offered a tremendous amount of information, so I'm gonna maybe during the Q&A, if someone wants to hear about immigration, that's something that I'd be happy to discuss. So I'm just gonna go back and repeat my first point again, because this is the thing I want to drive home. Anti-Semitism in America has taken on an array of different manifestations, and it's often hard to understand why they necessarily all belong lumped together. And in fact, understanding anti-Semitism merely as a conspiracy theory or as some extremely prominent public voices have said, as some sort of mental defect or personal failing, fails to capture the aim of anti-Semitism, the what anti-Semitism is designed to do, or the intellectual underpinnings of that political program. So again, anti-Semitism is a political program that is meant to undermine Jewish citizenship. It is meant to undermine Jewish equality. It is meant to tell Jews that you do not have access to the same rights that these other people deserve and do have access to. The main motivations for this movement have been Christian supremacy and conspiracy thinking, as well as scientific racism, which is probably the least appreciated but very central component of anti-Semitism in the United States. And using this understanding and using this definition, I would argue, very much helps us to analyze the current moment and think about what we as a community and we as individuals, we as thinking people, would like to assess and say is and is not anti-Semitism. So thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to engaging with you during the Q&A.
Thank you, Professor Tevis, for such an illuminating talk. I see there's many everyone to go ahead and submit more now. To get us started, just sort of before we get into the heavier stuff, somebody has asked if you can explain the history of the term anti-Semitism, and if it was created as a word to mean Jew hatred.
That's a great question. So anti-Semitism as a word is invented by anti-Semites, in fact, in Germany. It's often attributed to a journalist named Wilhelm Marr, although other scholars have disputed whether or not he as an individual created this subject, created this word. But Marr did start an organization in Germany that was aimed at denying Jews citizenship there. In the 1870s, there's this ongoing debate, across Europe and in the United States, but specifically in this case in Central Europe, which unifies to become Germany, about in our newly created country, who deserves to be a citizen? Who should we include? For people who were against Jews being included in this newly created nation, they identified themselves as anti Semites. Again, Semites were supposed to, the Semite and was meant to describe members of people who spoke Semitic languages, because one variation of this racial ideology determined that people's biological races were closely associated with the languages they spoke. And so people who spoke Semitic languages, such as Hebrew, should not be included. They slapped that label on, were anti the Semites. They had a club. And Jews then very soon thereafter also started defining people who explicitly said, we do not want Jews to have rights here. We do not want Jews to have rights. Those are those are who anti-Semites are. So in many ways, I would say that my definition of anti-Semitism is really just kind of reclaiming the original meaning. And then I should say other variations of the idea of anti-Semitism, such as religious anti-Semitism, social anti-Semitism. These are terms that quickly emerged by the 1890s in the English-speaking world. Thank you for that question.
Yes, thank you. Wonderful answer. Somebody asked here, Christian nationalism and conspiratorial thinking are certainly present today. And today in the US, is racialism still around?
You noticed? No. Yes, it pains me to say that all three of these ideas are making a comeback in ways that I find hard to believe. So the idea of Jewish racial particularism is especially prominent among people on the far right. Right, neo-Nazis, right? They never dropped this idea. Hitler, of course, was probably the most famous person to disseminate this idea. But certainly it remains with us, particularly among members of the far right. Every now and then you will encounter particularly like local and state representatives who will tweet something about Jewish racial particularism. I'm for some reason forgetting the label of this certain group of men who basically don't date, but a large number of their complaints are about Jewish men in particular who are willing to who basically procreate with non-Jewish women, and they're very upset about them. So yes, the rise of scientific race, the return of scientific racism as a legitimate way of thinking about people and human difference has unfortunately made a return.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think it also comes up, I feel like in popular culture at times where people will, wear big noses or something that is.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Similar or related question. I'm curious, I'm quoting the person here. I'm curious when the transition from Jews being seen as non-white to largely only white, with the white colonizer trope being seen everywhere, was there a turning point? And this person asked, does it matter? Like what is the history there?
So I'm so glad you asked that question, because this is something I've given a lot of thought to, and is actually an area of writing and scholarship that I'm working on in this present moment, which is this idea and the relationship between Jews and whiteness. So there does exist a small scholarship on this, and I think the scholarship really ranges in quality about Jews and whiteness. So there are two major things to keep in mind. One is about non-Jews, how non-Jews have perceived and racialized Jews. And a second is how Jews have racialized themselves, how Jews have racialized themselves. So it's important to remember that 100% of the time, 100%, and I, as a historian, almost never say this. I tell my students, never say always, but this is a case in which we can always say this. 100% of the time, racialization is a political statement. There's always a political motive behind what one defines oneself as racially, or what one defines another person as racially. And so we can see that Jews have defined themselves racially according to some political end. So by way of example, in the late 19th century, Jews had just witnessed the implementation of something called the Chinese exclusion laws, in which the United States determined that it would not permit any Chinese immigrants into the United States except in some very, very minor, with some very minor exceptions. And seeing the application of racial categories as a means of exclusion, some pretty big name Jewish lawyers in the United States said, "Oh, we better nip this in the bud. We cannot go around calling ourselves members of a race. We are not members of a race. We are white." And they furiously wrote many, many, many letters to the Immigration and Naturalization Services saying, we don't want to be categorized as Hebrews. We're not Hebrews. We are not racially distinct. We are Caucasian. We're white and Caucasian at best, part of this larger white family. Do not call us white. We're not white. Excuse me. Do not call us Jewish. We're white. At the same time, there was this very small minority of individuals that would grow who, for whom it was very important to not be identified as white, but Jews who said it's very important to be defined actually by Jewish racial distinctiveness. And these are people that called themselves Zionists, because the Zionist program was premised on the idea that yes, Jews do not belong in Germany and Jews do not belong in the United States. They belong, in fact, in their own nation state, and that they would be, rehabilitated, rejuvenated if given the opportunity and the right to self-determination. And so for Zionist Jews, it was very important to be identified as racially distinct, whereas for non-Zionist Jews, particularly in America, it was very important to identify as white. So that's Jews talking about Jews. As far as non-Jews, racializing Jews, the answer, I don't have a complete answer because this is, again, something I'm working on right now. I think, but this is my hypothesis. I suspect, and I have reason to believe, I have evidence to suggest this is true. Jews are called white not as a means of saying, hey, we want to offer you the full array of rights here in this country. We're going to, categorize you with this group who we offer all of these rights to. Jews are white as a means of scolding Jews and telling Jews that they have done something wrong. And I'm going to offer two different examples of that. The first example is, and I think in the question that Matt posed, used the word colonialism. The first example concerns the present moment in which American Jews, whatever their relationship is to Israel, many people are saying to American Jews, you personally are responsible for what is happening in Gaza. You personally are responsible for what's happening in the West Bank because you are a white colonizer. And yeah, maybe there are some Sephardic Jews, we're going to leave them out of this, but the majority of you are Ashkenazi descended Jews. Look at your skin color. You are white. You have always been granted a full array of rights, and you should know better. We're like, as a mean, so the whiteness is a means of scolding Jews regardless of whatever their relationship to Israel is. I also know of an example of this operating similarly in the, I think it was, I believe the 1920s, in which a Jewish man tried to go to dinner with a Black person. I don't know what their relationship was. I assume they were likely dating, but a Black person at a restaurant that served Black people in Harlem. And he was denied entry under the guise that of separate, but it's okay to exclude people according to their race, because this is after the post-Civil War Civil Rights Act has been struck down. And before the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Law, right, exclusion from places of public accommodation according to race was acceptable. And the judge in that case, he sues saying, hey, I deserve to go into this restaurant as much as anyone else. Why can't I go in? And the judge says, no, you're white, and it is permissible to exclude people according to race. And so you have no right to sue. You have no right to sue. So here, again, whiteness is not a means of Jews having seen the expansion of their rights in this case, right? Whiteness in this case is a way for the judge to say, no, it is permissible for us, the court, to deny you the capacity to dine with your Black companion. Again, that's a shrinking of rights, not the expansion of rights. And so I think that this notion of whiteness and Jews' inclusion in the category of white has transpired, but has never been permanent. It's never something that's stuck definitively. And really, this idea of Jewish whiteness, as described by non-Jews, it appears only as a means of limitation. I cannot think of when it has been afforded to Jews as a means of and intended to expand their rights. But thank you. That's a great question.
Thank you. Yeah, and for the beginning of what you mentioned, you talked about Israel and how the conflation between Jews and the policies of Israel. And I wasn't sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second, but I don't know if you want to say more about that, but also it seemed to relate also to the second half of what you're saying of certain groups using whiteness as as a limiting of rights or like
And as an accusation,
as
as
an
a really a saying, I think particularly in this moment, I see whiteness. And there's a scholar named David Schwab, who has a really interesting article actually about Jews and whiteness and the ways that when you add Jews, white to Jewish, white Jewish, the description of whiteness, it really functions in some way itself as suggesting Jews having too much power, because the term Jewish already in and of itself inherently there's a sense that, oh, Jews are already powerful. And so white, which also has an idea of whiteness, is saying like powerful, powerful person, right? Jews have somehow, not only are they white, but they have some outsized amount of power that they should not have. And so, which is again to say that when thinking about the ways that people have racialized Jews as white, and particularly specifically how non-Jews have racialized Jews as white, what I'm suggesting is I think often, if not in the majority of circumstances, it is done not as a means of being welcoming or saying, yes, we are going to include you. It's a means of saying you are somehow guilty of something. You have done something wrong, and we, the person who is calling you white, have the desire to shame you for this. And this is how we're going to do it.
Thank you. Um, going back to sort of more the beginning of your talk, there's some questions about the laws in different parts of the country and states. One of them, to get us started, mentions that what do state constitutions regarding the state constitutions and examples of anti-Semitic rules? What should we make of the First Amendment establishment and free exercise clauses and Article 6 of the Constitution, which states that there should be no religious test for holding office?
When you say what should we make of them, well, uh, I mean, I'm a strong advocate for the strict separation of church and state, and I'm also a strong advocate for the First Amendment and all of the freedoms included within it. I think that the relationship between Jews and free speech is a history that's exceptionally interesting, not only in this present moment, but the ways in which efforts to really stymie Jewish free speech have been used for anti-Semitic ends. And I'm thinking in this moment particularly about anti-World War I activists and Jewish socialists in New York and the ways in which before 1925, before the Supreme Court determined that that the First Amendment actually did apply to individuals in the state, Jews were subjected to fairly stringent limitations on their capacity to, express their political desires, and in some cases were even denaturalized as a result of their engagement in free expression, including expressions about protesting the Russian Civil War, etc. So my feelings on free speech, love it. And think it's worthy of protecting. And similarly, I am a strong advocate of separating church and state.
Thanks. And uh, related, under your definition of anti-Semitism, how does anti-Israel speech um, fit in?
Thank you for that question. When I first started giving this talk, I used to really fear that question, like, oh, is someone going to realize and ask me? But now I love this question because I figured it out for myself. I figured it out for myself. And honestly, this exact question really for me has like been a useful test of the legitimacy and utility of the definition of anti-Semitism that I've offered, because it again offers the chance for me to say, is this a circumstance? And I think I'm gonna broaden your question a little bit, which is about the degree to which, if at all, whether or not anti-Zionism constitutes anti-Semitism. I know this is a dirty word, but it's all about context. And I know we're not supposed to use that term anymore, but again, if the question is about inequality, if the question is about inequality, the question here is whether or not the anti-Zionism is intended to result in Jewish inequality. So by way of example, if anti-Zionist expression can or will result in the exclusion of students, all Jewish students, from a certain club, then it seems to suggest that, in fact, that expression of anti-Zionism is, in fact, anti-Semitism because it leads to the exclusion and the denial of equality for Jews from being members of, whatever club I'm thinking specifically on a college campus. Alternatively, if Jews are not being treated differently, but treated as any other person would be, then I would not define that as anti-Semitism. And so, for example, in the case of Israel, I've heard people say, "Well, I don't think Israel should exist. I'm just anti-Zionist. I'm not anti-Semitic." And I say, "Okay, what about all the other countries? Are we saying that all countries shouldn't exist? All countries shouldn't exist, or just one very specific country in which the absence of which would result in the denial, not in an abstract way, in a real way, right? There are Jews living in a country. The nullification of the existence of that country would actually result directly in the denial of rights for those people, unless we're doing this globally, in which case, not unequal. So again, the context really matters. Ordinarily, people are not advocating for the elimination of all countries, just one case. So in that case, specifically, often I think there's every reason to believe that that indeed is anti-Semitic, which is not to say that every expression of anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. It is a Venn diagram, but they are not perfectly overlapping. And to make this determination really requires really drilling down on the specifics, the rhetoric, the intention of the speaker, the circumstances in which a comment is made. I know this is not a satisfying answer, but it is, I think, the most intellectually honest answer, which is the specifics really matter.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense to me. So hopefully, our audience also. A few people have asked you. You mentioned the immigration laws. Would you like to say more about that?
Sure. So immigration has historically been one of the major arenas in which Jews have encountered a tremendous amount of anti-Jewish bigotry in the United States. And we can see that, as I mentioned, and gesture towards the end of my talk, in the specific text of the passage of legislation, and the ways in which American immigration law was conceptualized and then passed throughout the late 19th and early 20th century. American immigration law really only became under the umbrella of the federal government in the late 19th century during the federal government's major expansion after the Civil War. And they passed really their first major immigration laws in 1881, both with the Chinese exclusion law on the heels of an earlier law called the Page Act in 1873, but the anti-Chinese exclusion law. And that year they passed their first also general immigration law. And then every few years subsequently from 1881 through 1924, anti-immigration voices in America tried to determine new cutting-edge ways to exclude immigrants in the United States. And so that included the basic gist of the immigration regime was to distinguish between so-called desirable and so-called undesirable immigrants. And through this process, which included analysis of individuals' health and their economic, their wealth, through this process, Jews are racialized by the immigration services and officers in the US government and determined to be very undesirable. In large part, that was based on the perception of Jewish radicalism, also on the perception of Jewish weakness, really, the inability of Jews to do, real work, meaning be farmers, and the notion of like the Jewish intellectual not being a desirable worker. And so efforts were made and eventually became quite successful to exclude Jews, specifically also Southern Italians, but really this racialized language of the Jewish radical and the Jew as harmful to the health of the nation can be found in congressional records and Senate reports, congressional reports, House reports, throughout the US government, throughout the State Department, as why we need to bar Jews from the United States. Eventually, this actually takes place in large part through the passage of an emergency quota law in 1921, which is then made permanent in 1924, which severely limited the number of immigrants that were eligible to come to the United States from any given country based on a quota. And that quota, the numbers used and developed for that quota, the number was based on the 1890 US Census. And the reason Congress used the 1890 US Census is because it determined that this was a time when the racial proportion, the proportion of races relative to one another was best, which is another way of saying it was before most Jews had landed in America. Most Jews, a majority of Jews in the 20th and came to America between 1880 and 1924. About 2.5 million Jews immigrated to America between 1880 and 1924. And this law, when it was passed, was saying, we want to go back in time to when there weren't that as many Jews here in the United States. So we're going to limit the number of people eligible for admission from Eastern Europe. And this was not the end. The quota system helped set the stage for the denial of admission of refugees during the Holocaust. But this anti-immigrant sentiment persisted even after the war in discussions of displaced people, which, and in fact, the very first displaced people's law was written specifically to deny admission to Eastern European victims of the Holocaust because of the requirements within the law about where refugees had to be by December of 1945, which meant that all the Jews which had moved eastern to the east would not have made it back into refugee camps by December of 1945, rendering them ineligible to enter America. These are details, all of which to say that from the get-go and well through the 1970s, really until the end of the Cold War, American immigration law helped to facilitate anti-Jewish exclusion from American shores, and intentionally so in really explicit and appalling ways.
Thank you. There's one subject that we haven't touched on, so I want to give it a moment, and then we can sort of end on a final question. But I don't know if there's anything you want to say about the role of anything more you want to say about the role of religion. And one person asked, what role does the belief that Jews bear particular guilt for the death of Christ play in anti-Semitism?
Oh, great question. You know, it's so interesting because that is something that my students frequently are surprised to learn, because the Jews killed Christ. The belief that Jews that killed Christ is no longer kind of like the most prominent weapon that is used against Jews. That being said, one place that I have seen this appear over and over again is in anti-peddler, like the death of peddlers. Frequently in 19th century newspapers, when Jewish peddlers are murdered, they're frequently in the newspaper article, it will be mentioned that the murderer will often be like, "You're a Christ killer." Also, a lot of oral histories I've listened to about by Jews talking about their childhood, particularly in the mid 20th century, so let's say between the 1950s and 1970s. Many of these oral histories, the person giving these histories will explain, that they would be beaten up on the street, and like they're by a classmate, and the classmate, while beating them up, would call them a Christ killer. So I do think the rhetoric and in particularly often I think when we see tensions between Catholics and Jews in particular, so in Boston and basically in American cities, the idea of the Jews killing Christ does crop up, but I think less so among people who are promoting these racial ideologies. And the other question, Matt, I got so excited by this question about Christ. Well, you asked a second question that escapes me.
Oh, I think it was more broad. I think you touched on the main point of the question there. So
Okay.
um, there's just several people as we close, and you're welcome to close with whatever final words you would also like. But a number of people have asked, just given that this history of anti-Semitism in the U.S., um, have you uncovered any ways that could help us respond to it today?
Oh, I love that question because it's hopeful. I do think I know that I, this only helps my effort, but I am invested in education. I do think that exposing the uglier elements of American history and exposing the ways in which America has failed to live up to what I think is an amazingly beautiful promise in the U.S. Constitution. Promising to treat all of its citizens and its population as equals. I think looking at the moments in which America has failed to meet that promise is a way to hold the country accountable. And so that is something that I aspire to do in my research and in my teaching. And I wish I had a magic wand, of course. But this is the best I got so far.
Thank you. So thank you again. I know it's right about 9 now. So thank you again so much for sharing expertise and tackling all these questions. I know there were over 50 questions. So sorry to everybody that we weren't able to get to all of them. Maybe we'll be able to bring Professor Tevis back, because there's just so many questions about so many different things that I try to keep them in broad strokes. So thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me.